Good evening. In the introduction to this channel, I articulated that this is an exercise in building my philosophy of life and making it more cohesive as I sort things out and work on individuation in the Jungian sense. One thing I want to mention, in my video about sorting myself out in my late 40s, I mentioned that one of the key elements is reading hard books, more specifically nonfiction, but also fiction to some extent. Now, I have a confession, and this is embarrassing. I barely read anything for like 20 years, and I'm not really clear how this happened. I come from an intellectual family that are all writers and who value reading highly. And I guess the only thing, there are some reasons why that didn't happen, which I'd prefer not to go into, but the main reason I would say is I was really caught up in the visual arts and the visual world, and my vernacular was visual for all that time. It was art, visual art based, I guess you would say, and I was making my living in the arts. So when I switched professions, I discovered reading again. And I discovered this amazing world that I'd been missing. And believe me, if I had to do it over again, I certainly would have integrated more reading. But my point is, I'm behind in some of the basics, so I've had to work like a mad woman to catch up, and I'm clearly not caught up yet. There's some really basic stuff that I just don't know, trying to learn. Jordan has helped, and most of my experience with Jordan were, in fact, his classes as I was trying to catch up, and specifically his psychology class, but certainly Maps of Meaning. It was interesting. I was well into his stuff when the political situation emerged just out of the blue. So it was fascinating to see that happen, and to see him become super famous. But other YouTube channels have helped me as well, and it's fantastic that you can be reading something very difficult and then go online and find lectures by the experts in that particular topic. Jonathan Haidt, for example, when I was reading The Righteous Mind, he's got tons of lectures pertaining to that book, where he would outline the framework. You know, he would discuss the whole book itself, really, in some kind of academic or institutional lecture. And there's someone I want to give a shout out to, someone who's really helped me with philosophy, and that's Dr. Greg Sadler, who is a PhD in philosophy who decided to relinquish the world of academia for a variety of reasons, and is kind of doing it on his own, partially through YouTube and through online classes and various other things, consultation. And so he's well worth checking out for some philosophy lectures that really clarify things, so I'll put a link to that. This week on YouTube, I found a couple of things that were very interesting. The first one is, of course, I'm sure a lot of people are talking about this, is the Russell Brand and Jordan Peterson interview. And the first thing that struck me about this interview was the lightning quick intelligence of Mr. Brand. Really not what I expected for some reason. And I guess that's a lesson, not to judge a book by the cover. As an aside, Dudley Moore, you know, kind of related, was a very intelligent man. That I don't think people knew that. But Brand really kept up with Jordan, and that's saying a lot, obviously. What's more is he challenged Jordan in an important way. Now, one problem I see emerging in this whole restructuring of the social political environment is the problem of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Even though social justice warriors of today and third-wave feminists seem to be a group of people that are entranced in some kind of thought prison, I guess you would say, that professes to help the marginalized without, I don't think it's actually doing much, besides really a big pat on the back, I suppose. there still is a place in this world for both feminism and for social justice. We need both. We need both feminism and social justice to deal with the 2 to 6% of the variable of sexism and racism that does in fact exist in income-producing environments and other institutions. And it's important to keep that at bay because although it doesn't explain everything, it does explain, you know, a certain percentage of the variables, say, of gender pay gap, obviously. Now, Jonathan Haidt said this clearly. He said, we need social justice to maintain its telos. However, as he said, the telos of social justice is replacing that of some institutions, primarily the universities, but other places as well. In my video about Sargon's gender pay gap video, where I was responding to that, I showed a graphic pertaining to gender that the left has deemed appropriate to circulate at large in these institutions and in schools, and something that should not be. This ideology has determined that this sort of thing is appropriate for children, which it isn't. However, that doesn't mean there isn't a place for social justice, and that's what's good about Brand. He's no social justice warrior, which I kind of expected him to be. He actually has an educated view of the whole thing. He appears to be a very educated person in general. But he realizes that social justice, or rather guaranteeing equality of opportunity and assisting the downtrodden, is still functionally necessary, and he questions Peterson about it. Now, it's easy, especially for Peterson's adversaries, to imagine his views are more conservative in this area than they actually are. So one of the good things about this interview was giving Peterson a chance to articulate his views on helping vulnerable populations and addressing inequality, which Peterson clearly stated is a major problem. We don't often get a chance to hear his viewpoint much on topics like this due to the fact that he's, too busy articulating the mythical substrate of being and stuff. So, good interview in many ways, and I thought the chemistry was excellent, if you ask me. The second very good thing on YouTube for me this week was the Paul Vander Klay and Jonathan Pageau dialogue. So I'm a huge fan of Pageau. I have been since his first video with Jordan. Fascinating. I had a friend who converted to Orthodoxy for pretty much the reason Jonathan seems to be describing. That in that faith you can connect with the living Christ and directly experience these deep patterns he's talking about. He also makes it clear that what symbolism is exactly and how pervasive it necessarily is in cultural expression, and why things that align with this pattern work. And that's, of course, what Jordan says is when you get the mythology right, you can slot right into it, with your own being. Jonathan Pageau did a analysis of Logan using this symbolic framework. And I recently saw it, and I recommend it. It's a little too violent for me, but quite good. Layered, it's meaningful, it's nuanced in a lot of ways. Certainly not a standard superhero flick. And I think actually, and Pageau mentioned this, Jonathan mentioned this, I think the presence of the female character, Logan's child, Logan's daughter, was not a gratuitous, politically correct decision. Dr. X makes it clear that the child is endowed with the special claw on her foot that Wolverine lacks, and she has it because she's female and because it will aid her in defending her children. And Dr. X makes a clear reference to her future motherhood. Also, Pageau recommends this book, Saint Ephrem the Syrian, Hymns on Paradise. I just got this a couple hours ago in the mail, so I'm looking forward to that. In his writing, Ephrem posits an inherent link between the material and the spiritual worlds. Now, that sounds pretty familiar. It seems to be primarily poetry, so I'm very much looking forward to reading that. Vander Klay, there's Paul Vander Klay. I guess he's Protestant Dutch Reform. I'm afraid my theology, one of the areas that I'm interested in but am lacking in knowledge, so I hope I got that right, is a wonderful YouTube discovery who most people watching this probably know. It was a very nice back and forth with Pageau, two men with sophisticated views of Christianity, and a consensus, I think, that Christianity needs to correct with the living world of symbolism, and that was lost, I guess, after the Middle Ages. This is something you can see in art. Like if you go to the museum, you go to the to see religious paintings, and you can see how they changed from like from medieval, I guess, Gothic medieval art to Renaissance. So during that switch, art changes. So it starts to include representations of individuals, and usually these individuals are the artist's benefactors, I suppose. Whereas before that, it would be inconceivable to include these kind of depictions in the holy and fixed symbolic configurations of the biblical stories. Also, the notion. Now, this is my determination. This is not a scholarly. This isn't informed by scholarship, but for me, the notion of style for its own sake also emerges. And this transition, now what Vander Klay and Pageau are saying about that we need to go back to that sensibility kind of reminds me of what Phaedrus says in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He wants to go back to the sophists before philosophy was corrupted by Aristotle in a similar way. The sophists value something like the heroic over reason. And I thought that was interesting, an interesting similarity. So just as I'm honoring my appreciation for Pageau by reading Saint Ephrem, I'm also reading Mere Christianity that was recommended by Paul Vander Klay. And this, in fact, was recently sent to me by my godmother. As I've grown more interested in spirituality, she and I have connected over actually a very similar interest in people like C.S. Lewis and some other people I mentioned, the new contemplatives such as Richard Rohr and Cynthia Bourgeault, Gerald May, that group. So I read the Screwtape Letters, and what impressed me was the lack of necessity of the true Christian to worry about what the world thinks of him personally. He is converted into being with Christ in the truest sense, and by the same token, the true Christian relinquishes judgment of others on a personal level. And you can see this in the way Vander Klay addresses objections of people who have objections that people have voiced to Christianity, such as he completely gets why someone would think that pastors are liars, and that doesn't raise any ire in him at all. And in Mere Christianity, something is articulated that is of great interest to me, and might be to Jordan Peterson fans, is that there is a real right and wrong, and it has always been there. C.S. Lewis calls this the moral law, and moral law feels like an instinct in a way. And C.S. Lewis argues that while some might explain it away as an instinct, it's more than that. What I get from C.S. Lewis is that this moral law is related in a way to the same pattern that Jonathan is describing, and I'm not sure how at this point. I need to read both books. I'm not even halfway through with this one, but so far so good. And so I'm sure I'll have more to say about that. Finally, an update on The Blank Slate, which I'm also reading. Where is that? Finally, an update on this, The Blank Slate. Read the section on gender. It's toward the end of the book, or middle end. A lot of the material you hear Jordan, Sargon, and others in the dark intellectual web used to defend the human nature position. For example, the biological differences between men and women, well, primarily. You'll find in that section, you'll find a lot of the ideas seem to come from Pinker. And I think I kind of knew that. I started reading it because Gad Saad said that it was non-negotiable, that you have to read this book, and I can see why. So in that section, and this book was written in 2002, Pinker has divided feminism of the time into equity feminism. And don't be scared by the word equity. What he means is equal opportunity for women, of which he mentions several people, including Christina Hoff Sommers and Camille Paglia. And the other side is gender feminism, which is the militant anti-human nature, patriarchy-blaming ilk of Gloria Steinem and Andrea Dworkin. So I've been on YouTube for a month now, and it's been a great world to join. It has me thinking things out, because I can't be totally incoherent if I have to speak in front of an audience. So I hope that made sense, and I'll see you next time.